Death at Bishop's Keep. Chapter 7. You have read in the newspaper a murder, I hope. You cannot think how much more interesting a murder becomes from being committed at one's door. Jane Carlyle to her cousin Janine Welch. As the train from London pulled into the Colchester station, Kate eagerly rose from her seat in the first-class carriage she had shared with Eleanor Marston and Garnet, Miss Marston's personal maid. "We are here!" she cried excitedly, leaning from the open window to glimpse what she could of the platform. "At last!" Then she remembered herself and pulled back from the window, flushing. Miss Marston was rising in a leisurely way, directing Garnet to gather her cloak, her exquisite dyed kid gloves, her parasol, her reticule, the half-dozen bags and bandboxes she had brought with her from London, stuffed with, as Kate had been hearing for the last several hours, wedding finery. To the sophisticated Miss Marston, Kate thought, her pleasure in the sights and sounds of her arrival must seem terribly inexperienced and gauche, rather like a schoolgirl on an adventure. Kate tossed her head, but she was inexperienced, and this was an adventure for her. She could scarcely wait to see the massive walls of Bishop Keep rising like a mossy ruin out of the surrounding grove of ancient oaks, the sunset gilding its great stone turrets. If the truthful expression of pleasure in either her journey or her arrival was amusing to her elegant travelling companion, so be it. So she repeated with enthusiasm as she reached for her carpet-bag, "How lovely to be here at last!" Eleanor Marston inspected the fluff of silvery blonde bangs and the tilt of her plum-coloured straw hat in the small mirror that Garnet held up for her. "You must be appallingly tired, my dear Miss Audley. It is such a long and tedious journey all the way from New York." It had been a long journey, Kate thought, but hardly tedious. To her surprise and pleasure, the steamship passage Mr. Kellerman had arranged for her at her aunt's direction, as well as the railway tickets from Liverpool to London and from London to Colchester, had been first-class accommodation, an acknowledgment, no doubt, that she was an Audley, albeit a distant one. Had she been a mere secretary companion, she would have been sent third class. But although Kate's unfashionable clothing and flyaway hair set her apart from the extravagantly gowned and coiffed transatlantic voyagers, she did not feel the least uncomfortable. On the contrary, the excitement of the journey had charged her. Her imagination examined each sight, each exchange, each person, as a possible subject matter for the sensational story that Beryl Bardwell had promised to post, Kate's secretarial schedule permitting, to Mr. Qa'Rajh. After all, Kate reminded herself, she had not accepted her new position because she needed the money, she was confident of supporting herself with a pen, but because she deeply desired adventure. If she were going to write sensational stories, she needed to live a sensational life. It was impossible to describe from the heart what she had not expected. It had been the rarest and most wonderful chance that Aunt Sabrina had risen like a spectre out of the mist to offer her this Excalibur of widened horizons. She would not squander the least moment of her journey. She would take note of it all. So she was especially gratified when Mrs. Snodgrass's priceless diamond necklace was discovered to be missing, and the gossip at the table implicated the ship's steward, a man, of it was rumoured, Egyptian origin, a swarthy fellow with slender tapering fingers and an evil look. For the following 2 days, Kate alternately posted herself in the stuffy hallway outside Mrs. Snodgrass's stateroom, and loitered on the deck near the office of the steward, pretending great interest in the starboard vista. But to her frustration, she was not afforded the opportunity to enter either room unobserved. Whether she would have was quite another question, and had to content herself with polite inquiries as to Mr. Snodgrass's health, and a casually phrased remark to the steward about camels, which met with a blank stare. She was downcast when Mrs. Snodgrass's maid turned up the missing jewels in the laundry. Thus it was that the embryonic deadly diamonds, which was to have followed Amber's amulet, on which she was just getting a start, was rudely aborted. But everything else about her journey had been perfect, down to the perfect coincidence of discovering that her fellow traveller in the first-class carriage from London to Colchester was Miss Eleanor Marston of Marston Manor, daughter of a baronet and her aunt's neighbour. Marston Manor, it turned out, was only 3 miles from Bishop Keep. Life was indeed stranger than fiction. Kate was very glad to have met Miss Marston, whom she liked immediately. Clear-headed though she was about many things, Kate was given to forming quick opinions on the basis of short acquaintances. It was a character trait that Aunt Maureen had often cautioned her to curb, although Kate stubbornly felt it a strength to be cultivated. A writer, she thought, should be a quick study of personality, able to see through the social facade straight to the heart of a person. In the case of Miss Marston, the heart did not seem too far to seek. She wore it like a talisman on her sleeve and loved to talk about what was in it. "There they are," Miss Marston called over her shoulder to Kate as she tripped across the platform, plum kid boots peeping from under the deep flounce of her elegant plum-coloured travelling suit. "Yoo-hoo!" she cried, waving. "Bradford, Charles, here we are." Kate watched with interest as a strikingly handsome, fair-haired young man ambled toward them. He was dressed in a stylish grey flannels, flawlessly tailored, and wore a smart grey bowler. He was accompanied by a man whose clothes were markedly less formal. "If it isn't our favourite spendthrift," the fair-haired man said jauntily. "Did you leave anything in the Regency Street shop, Ellie?" Miss Marston tapped him smartly on the arm. "Not a solitary ribbon or plume, dear brother. And since poor Garnet could not carry half of my extravagances, I ordered most of my purchases to be sent by post. Wait until you see the lavish waistcoat I brought for you, in the same shade of peacock as the one I purchased for Mr. Fairley." Mr. Ernest Fairley, Kate knew from Miss Marston's voluminous railway confidences, was Miss Marston's intended. His grandfather, the genius of Fairley's finest fancy candies, had founded the family fortune on chocolate. If Miss Marston's report were to be trusted, the marriage, which would take place at Christmas, was considered the match of the year. Kate had been aghast to learn that Mr. Fairley, a widower, was nearly 25 years older than his bride-to-be. Still, Miss Marston, whom for the moment of their meeting had scarcely stopped talking about Mr. Fairley's courtship, their impending vows, and the splendid Fairley family home in Kensington, did not seem unduly troubled at the thought of surrendering her carefree soul to a man who was her senior by a quarter of a century. Kate, for her part, could not imagine such a thing, or rather, she could imagine it all too clearly, and the image made her shudder. How could any thinking woman yield up her independence to the whim and will of some man who would become her guardian both in the eyes of law and society? How could she bear to be treated as if she were a wayward child who required adult protection from the dangers of the world, and from her own naive and ungovernable wilfulness? Not for her such a fate. The stylish man was peering toward the train hissing on the track, while the conductor shouted and slammed the coach doors, porters jangled baggage trucks, and passengers scurried to board. "Where is Aunt Penelope?" "She developed a frightful cold," Miss Marston said carelessly. "Really quite severe, poor thing. The doctor advised her to take to bed. Rather than wait, I came on without her." The young man frowned. "Papa will not be at all pleased, Ellie. You know his feelings on the subject of women travelling unescorted." Miss Marston gave him a dazzling smile. "But I was not alone, Bradford, my dear friend. My dear friend Miss Ardley was kind enough to accompany me, and of course I had Garnet. I'm sure Papa could not object." She drew Kate forward. "Miss Catherine Ardley, may I present my dear brother, the Honourable Bradford Marston, and his friend Sir Charles Sheridan, who is staying the month with us. Gentlemen, Miss Ardley is the niece of Miss Sabrina Ardley and Mrs. Bernice Jaggers. She has come to live with her aunts at Bishop Keep." Kate's amusement at Miss Marston's adroitness in giving her their accidental meeting the appearance of a planned jaunt was nearly lost in her astonishment. There were 2 aunts? But she could not question Miss Marston without revealing her ignorance about the situation into which she was walking, as Uncle O'Malley would have said, as blind as a bat. In spite of her intuitive liking for her companion, her own railway confidences had been discreetly reserved. She was anxious to know whether Bishop's Keep was indeed as romantic as she imagined, but she had not asked. Nor had she disclosed either her secretarial employment or the existence of Beryl Bardwell, and she had asked nothing about her aunt, leaving it to Miss Marston to think what she wished. "Charmed, I'm sure, Miss Ardley," Bradford Marston drawled, bending in a polished greeting over her hand. "How nice that you have come." He cocked a wry eyebrow. "And how felicitous for Eleanor. Now she will have a friend directly at hand. No doubt you will be required to properly admire her nuptial finery and envy her choice of husbands. Most of her friends, regrettably, fail to serve these necessary purposes, for they live in London. You will certainly be useful." "I am glad to share Miss Marston's joys," Kate said quietly, retrieving her hand. Miss Marston made a playful face. "Come now, Bradford, do behave." She turned to the other gentleman, who stood slightly behind her brother. "Sir Charles Sheridan, my dear Catherine, is a masterful photographer, famous for some picture or other that he took of the Queen at her Jubilee, and thereby earned his knighthood. You'll have to persuade him to take your portrait, as he did the Queen's and Mrs. Langtry's, but don't let him talk to you of fossils," she added with playful gaiety. "Once given leave to begin, the man scarcely know how to make a stop, and must be reined in with the firmest possible hand." Kate nodded at Sir Charles with interest, half expecting him to wear some visible token of his grandness, but as a knight he was a stunning disappointment, especially in comparison to the impeccably groomed, grinning Bradford Marston. Sir Charles' brown canvas jacket needed brushing. It was covered with lumpy pockets, stuffed from what she could see with odds and ends of scientific paraphernalia, magnifying lens, an ivory rule, a pair of calipers. His tweedy Norfolk breeches were tucked into scarred, heavily soled leather boots, and soft felt hat, broad-brimmed brown thing with a shapeless crown. It was pushed back on his curly brown hair, cut over long so that he looked like a buccaneer. From the look of him, Kate deduced that his knighthood was not a distinction that he valued highly. "Catherine," Miss Marston took her arm. "May I call you Catherine, my dear? And you really must call me Eleanor. I require it. It is so tedious to be formal." Without waiting for a response, she went on. "Dear Catherine has arrived a day sooner than expected, so I offered to take her to Bishop's Keep." Mr. Marston pursed his lips. "But, my dear sister, I fear that 5 is too many, given your monstrous load of parcels." Kate disengaged her arm. "I can wait here," she said hastily. "I can send word to Bishop's Keep to let them know I have arrived, and someone will be sent to fetch me. I shall not mind staying, truly." She would not, either. Beryl Bardwell would spend the time writing down everything she had seen from the clanking, steam-belching journey from London to Colchester, and as much as Eleanor's chit-chat as she could remember, as well as full descriptions of the elegant Bradford Marston and Sir Charles Sheridan, he of the lumpy pockets. And she would give her thoughts to what adventures and great mysteries lay ahead at Bishop's Keep, which she imagined as an enormous stone pile of arches and towers, shrouded by a mysterious haze and haunted by ghosts of dead Ardleys. Now that she was almost there, she had to permit to some anxiety. The sense of being alone in a strange place, so distant from the life she had known, the feeling of utter dependence on the goodwill of her unknown aunt, her 2 unknown aunts, made her feel apprehensive. Apprehension was not an emotion Kate was used to. She didn't particularly like it. "Actually, I prefer to stay behind," Sir Charles said. "I shall return to the scene of the murder to see if anything new has been found out, although," he added, as much to himself as to them, "judging from Sergeant Battle's muddled methods, I'd rather doubt it." Kate swivelled to look at Sir Charles. Eleanor squealed and clapped her hands. "Murder!" she cried. "How delightfully shocking! Charles, you naughty man, what dreadful scrape have you gotten yourself into now? You must tell us all about it as we ride. There is nothing I love quite as much as a good murder, especially when one of our party is involved in it." She possessed herself of Kate's arm once again. "And it is absolute balderdash to think of anyone staying behind," she added firmly. "We'll hire a man with a cart to take Garnet and the boxes, whilst we enjoy a leisurely drive through the countryside. You should know, dear Catherine, that the painter John Constable, who has memorialized our Dedham Vale in his landscapes, was Sir Charles' estimable great-uncle. Come now, everyone." Kate smiled. Clearly, problems were readily solved if one had money to hire the solution. But even though she continued to smile as Eleanor led them toward the carriage, She was at the same time surveying Sir Charles with greater interest, wondering exactly what sort of murder he meant. The carriage, with Kate's boxes roped at the end, proceeded through the Essex countryside, resplendent in the late summer glories. Blackbirds sang in the hawthorn hedges, apples ripened in the orchard, and the golden stubble fields were studded with standing sheaves of grain. But the sun was a flat silver disk, mist-shrouded in a pearl-grey sky. As they rode, the air thickened into a damp, cool fog. Bradford Marston seemed preoccupied, while Eleanor wheedled out Sir Charles a full account of the dead body in the dig, and Beryl Bardwell made careful mental note of every grisly detail that might enrich Amber's amulet. So far, her story was little more than character sketches of an Egyptian gentleman, greatly resembling the ship's steward in appearance and demeanour, and a mysterious medium named Miss Amber Bartlett, who wore an amulet and conducted seances in darkened rooms. It did not presently involve a murder, if only because Kate had not yet thought it all out, but the story would undoubtedly be better for one. She made a note to herself to look for the newspaper accounts of the Colchester tragedy, and at Sir Charles' mention of the photographs he had taken that morning, she asked to see them. "But, my dear Catherine," Eleanor protested in a shocked voice, "they are photographs of a dead man, and not merely dead, but shockingly murdered. One presumes that there was a great deal of blood," she shuddered with an eager delicacy. "The mere thought of it makes one quite faint." Then she smiled and patted Kate's hand. "But I forget, you are an American, and American women are reputed to be amazingly venturesome. You would not be daunted by a bit of blood, perhaps not even by the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds." She turned to Bradford. "Perhaps Miss Ardley would consent to your escorting us to Madame Tussauds, dear brother. I understand that Cecil Hambro's dreadful murderer has been newly installed, holding the very gun from which the fatal shot was fired." Having already heard of Madame Tussauds' famous waxworks and feeling that the jaunt would yield excellent story material, Kate instantly agreed to Eleanor's proposal. "It's not that I am particularly adventuresome," she added. "It is simply that I am fascinated by all facets of life, even death." She smiled at Sir Charles. "Hence my interest in your photographs." Bradford Marston roused himself from his preoccupation. "Sheridan, old chap, you're in luck. Someone actually wants to see those wretched snapshots of yours." He turned morosely to Kate. "Take my advice and don't encourage the fellow, Miss Ardley. He will not only insist on showing you his photographs, but his fingerprints as well." "Fingerprints?" Kate asked, finding that her opinion of Sir Charles was in need of revision. "You know about fingerprints?" Sir Charles held out his hand, palm up. "Indeed," he said. "The skin of each finger exhibits a unique set of ridges. Each time a finger touches the surface, it deposits a print, rather like a stab." "That much I know," Kate frowned. Sir Charles frowned. "You know?" "I read Pudd'nhead Wilson," Kate explained. "Mark Twain's novel, published last year in Century magazine. The murderer is convicted when the detective shows an enlarged drawing of a fingerprint to the jury." "Astonishing," Sir Charles murmured. "Absurd, Mr. Marston says. Shows how far novels are from the real world, convicting a man on the flimsy print of a finger." "Nevertheless," Kate said bravely, "at some time when you would care to explain more about the fingerprints of Charles, I would be interested in listening." And she sat back, fearing that she had called too much attention to herself already, when attention was the last thing she wished. In order for Beryl Bardwell to conduct her clandestine observations, she must remain discreet and undiscovered behind the mask of Catherine Ardley, docile, decorous secretary companion. But how interesting to encounter a man, however arrogant he might be, who could teach her something more than she already knew about fingerprints, and to encounter a murder, and not just a fictional murder either, but murder most real. So, as Eleanor Marston pointed out landmarks and interest along the way, Beryl Bardwell was devising a catalogue of things she needed to discover. Who was the murdered man? From whence had he come? And above all, who had done the deed and why? It was up to her to find the answers, or rather to create them. When it came to thrillers, Beryl Bardwell was constrained neither by truth nor by fact.